Hello, everyone, and welcome to Goucher Environmental Dialogues. I am Dr. Jen DeRosa. I'm the director of the Environmental Sustainability and Management Program at Goucher College. The Goucher Environmental Dialogues are a web-based speaker series, and we feature cultivated conversations with environmental sustainability and climate leaders, visionaries, and innovators. And the series is hosted by Goucher's progressive new master's degree in environmental sustainability and management, which we also happen to be having an information session about our innovative new master's degree program next week on July 11th. So if any of you guys are interested in learning more about our new master's degree program, I will later on in our conversation post a link to that. In fact, I'll post a link to our link tree in the chat in just a little bit, so you can access all of our social media and the registration to our information session next week on July 11th. And that's July 11th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. But our conversation today is about nature and psychological well-being. And this is really the time of year when the days are getting longer, and for many of us in the Northern Hemisphere, hotter, and we spend more time outdoors. I know I spent yesterday outdoors almost the entire day, and we're walking, we're going to the beach, we're camping with family, we might be going on a summer hike with friends. So perhaps around this time of year, you've maybe pause to think about spending a lot more time outside or spending time in nature. But have you ever paused to think about what the benefits of spending time in nature mean for your mental health? Whether soothing an anxious mind or managing grief, nature has the power to heal. So with me today is Dr. Heidi Schreiber-Pan, and she is the clinical director at Chesapeake Mental Health here in Maryland and the founder of the newly launched Center for Nature-Informed Therapy. She's a licensed professional counselor and a board-approved supervisor, and she specializes in the treatment of anxiety disorders, PTSD, OCD, stress reduction, and occupational burnout. Her research is focused on resiliency, psychological well-being, and nature-informed therapy. Dr. Schreiber-Pan is the author of the successful self-help book, Taming the Anxious Mind, and her new book, which I have here with me today, is the Outside Within, Stories of Nature's Role in Psychological Well-Being, which came out this April, and I highly recommend reading it because I really enjoyed reading the stories included within it. Now, please join me because I realize this is a webinar, so you can't turn on your cameras and you can't turn on your mics. So bear with me here. Join me by giving a warm welcome to Heidi by indicating in the chat where you're logging in from, because we typically have people logging in from all over the place geographically. So where are you logging in from? What city or state or country? And if you have any questions during Heidi and I's conversation today, you can always post them in the chat. You can also post them in the Q&A as well. And I will definitely leave time at the end of our conversation to give voice to your questions and ask them to Heidi. So good morning, or I should say good afternoon, because it's 1 p.m. here. So Heidi, to get us started, since I mentioned nature-informed therapy in my introduction, can you explain to our audience joining us today what nature-informed therapy is and how it's similar to or different than traditional therapy?
Okay, great. Well, everyone, I'm so happy that you're here and perhaps listening later on to the recording. But it's an honor to talk a little bit about the intersection of mental health and nature. I want to speak a little bit about this idea of sort of nature-informed therapy. And I just wanted to mention that my dissertation back in 2015, I looked at the role of nature and how it impacts psychological well-being and resiliency. And the goal was to write the research project, to finish my dissertation, but really to end up having a living, breathing organization that does things that connects mental health and nature. So that's how I found myself to the topic. But the question really of like, what is it and how is it different or similar? In order to answer that, I want to give you maybe a little bit of an illustration. So let's say I have a client that comes in with generalized anxiety disorder, lots of worrying, sort of a hyperactive nervous system. And we start working together in the counseling room and introduce these different techniques that you might be familiar with cognitive behavioral therapy. And so after a few months, usually clients feel better, they get better, and they, go on their happy way. Now, that is sort of a traditional example of what therapy might look like. So nature-informed therapy is quite different because in some way, I immediately start integrating what I like to think of as the co-therapist named nature. See, the thing is when a person comes in and they are filled with pain, they're filled with anxiety, they simply cannot care about 1,000-year-old tree being cut down, right? Because our capacity is limited and it often, the attention goes to where the pain is, right? So, of course, they're not going to be able to really care about environmental concerns if they are feeling so dysregulated. Now, the first example I gave of my client and coming into the office will leave feeling better, and that's great, but I've missed a chance to really do a deeper connection with the natural world. Because here's the goal. The goal is that I will take myself out of this treatment modality, right? I want my client to solidify their relationship with the natural world so that they can turn to the natural world at a later point when they again would need some extra help and care. So if nature is my co-therapist and we're immediately kind of integrating that piece, we might go outdoors, we might be indoors, but we talk about their connection to nature. Because I believe, just like in eco-psychology, we believe that the disconnect between humans and nature is one of the causes, or it magnifies our mental health challenges. And if we don't bring that in, it's not really a sustainable way to help people be resilient. So we bring nature in from the very start. It could be that a client, I did have this happen to me. I had a client that said, I saw on your website you do nature informed. I am not really an outdoors person. So you don't have to do that part with me. I will tell you that after a few sessions, because I'm always looking for the thread back to nature, because humans are nature. It's not something that is out there that we have to kind of get back in. We are nature, and I know we all have different connections. And later on, I realized that this specific client had a thread to nature through fishing, because that was the experience she had as a child that were positive memories around fishing with her dad. And so we started integrating water and what water can do for her mental health. So in some way, the traditional form doesn't integrate nature the way nature informed does. And I also want to point out that psychotherapy in 2023 is based on 150-year-old models of Western psychology, and I believe they're outdated. And outdated in a way that we now want to think outside the box. And one of the ways to think outside the box is to bring in the natural world.
Thank you for explaining that. And I think you had a lot of different points there, some of which I'm going to dive into in more depth later in terms of like those different types of nature connections, because a lot of that is actually very well illustrated in your stories book that I just read, because there's a lot of different ways those connections can be established. But before we get into stuff like that, I wanted to first ask maybe a little bit more explicitly, what are maybe the challenges to nature-informed therapy, but then again, what are some of the benefits, more explicit benefits of using nature to heal versus the more traditional therapy approaches?
Yes, yes. So there are some obstacles, and like I mentioned, right, the traditional psychotherapy model is based on 150-year-old models. And so those models say we have to be indoors, it has to be confidential, it needs to be in this sort of container setting that is your office, right? And what we're proposing is that that's not really close to real life, right? This container that's your office. If I do a walk and talk session and we're walking through nature together, we're much closer to what actually real life is for my client, right? So we want to think about a little bit more about how nature informed has this sort of way that we can integrate like real life things that happen. Now, can I prevent someone coming up from us at a walk and talk session and start chatting? No, I cannot. But what we often do is we talk about, hey, when we do a walk and talk session, here's what we're going to do if someone interrupts our session, right? Someone will come up and says, oh, it's so good to see you, Heidi. How you been? I have sort of my go-to script that I will say, it's nice to see you. I'm in the middle of something. I will talk to you later. And we kind of move on. Now, that's real life. We get interrupted, right? And also this idea that there is so much research that talks about the benefit of the brain and the body when we're in outdoor settings, right? There's a whole sensory piece that's so helpful. Mostly what I think of when I talk to people about what was different for you being indoors or outdoors is that people feel or become more relaxed. So that nervous system activation, if you think of it as a volume, it kind of gets tuned down. The sound of birds, the movement of wind, are the motion of the body, right, propelling forward. There's just different temperatures. It's all those pieces that help our nervous system sort of regulate easier. Even sitting on the ground with people, and just so much easier to start leading some mindfulness exercises when we're outdoors, because we're naturally, sorry for the pun, but we're naturally more reflective and grounded when we're outdoors in the natural world.
And that's really interesting to think about, because it reminded me, and I actually don't remember where I read this, so I really hope no one cites me on any of this, but I recall reading somewhere that there was a study done of people that had been walking indoors on trampolines versus walking outdoors, and there was a difference, and I don't remember how statistically significant it was, but there was like a difference in their blood pressure. Those who had been walking outdoors, same amount of walking versus those on the treadmill, had a better blood pressure, and it was attributed to being just the outside factor. Again, I don't recall where I read that though, so please no one cite me on that. But I find that to be fascinating, just the impact of that well-being of being outdoors. And that makes me curious, like what led you personally to the use of nature in the therapy process? Did you have a personal experience with nature that sort of led to a eureka moment for you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's one of the things I've been thinking about since I'm trying, like the vision for me is to have every mental health professional trained in nature-informed therapy. And one of the things that I always say to a group of, healing professionals is that, show of hands, how many of you here partner with nature for your own self-care? Who goes to the beach? Who goes on a hike? Who likes to sit in the meadow? Who seeks out the lake, right? And 8 out of 10 hands go up. And so if we know that it's helpful for us, why are we not using or partnering with nature to bring this to our clients, right? So yeah, I find myself personally, rejuvenated by nature, but it's not just rejuvenation. There's so many other benefits to it, right? It's one thing that I like to talk about at some point is this idea of like distress tolerance, that when we're outdoors, there's usually something that's can be uncomfortable. It's hot, it's cold, it's rainy, there are ticks, there are mosquitoes. And actually saying yes to those discomforts, right? To say, that's okay, I'm gonna stay out here for a few more minutes because being hot is not gonna kill me. Actually, that sort of ability to practice the stress tolerance in the natural world is in some way, I think of it as a homecoming, because that's who we used to be, right? We've only been indoors for the last 200 years of our evolution. We're talking about 2.5 million years of evolution, and only the last 200 years we've been indoors. So of course, when we go outdoors, our brain and our body recognizes that this is so much more our home and our DNA than it is being inside of a concrete building, where we're cut off from all the sensory information that nature has for us. So I have personally felt, spiritually connected to nature. I felt, my mental health improve. So that brought up to me this idea of like, why can't we bring this in a competent way to professionals who then can introduce their clients, their patients to this? Because by 2050, we're looking at 70% of the human population will be living in urban settings, right? So more of a disconnect that we're seeing. And so, but there's nature in urban settings. It's up to us to bring people to it.
That's a very good point. And that also makes me think too of all of the different ways that someone can interact with nature. I was recently traveling in some really big cities in Europe, and there are some cities that are very, very green and have some substantial green spaces, and you can connect with nature quite well in some urban areas. And then there are some other cities where you feel like you're surrounded by concrete. So I think that's a very good point to make. And that leads me to think about the different types of connections with nature that you incorporate in your book. In your recent book, The Outside Within: Stories of Nature's Role in Psychological Well-Being, it's a collection of stories that are written by people that have been transformed by nature. And so my first question is, how did you pick whose stories to include in your book? Because they're very vast and they cover many different aspects of interacting with nature, from overcoming fears of nature to overcoming challenges, personal challenges while being in nature, to overcoming grief just by being in nature in some way, and some of them were as simple as growing something and overcoming something by growing something. And it really resonated with me, because having come off the pandemic, my way of coping with the pandemic was to turn my barren yard into a pollinator garden, and that was how I mentally dealt with the pandemic. So I was very impressed by the collection of stories in your book. How did you choose which ones to include in your book?
Yeah, I think that it goes back to this idea of these different connections and finding different threads, right? I wanted to, in the book, be able to offer a variety of ways that people can connect to nature. My background, I grew up on the border between Austria and Germany. And so I was, the sound of music was my backyard. I was in the mountains, most of the time, hiking or skiing in the winter. My dad was a mountaineer. That's my connection, or it's one of my connection. That's not everyone's thread, right? And I understand that. And I think that as we are training mental health professionals to be nature informed, we have to have an understanding that everyone's connection will be very different, and we do a solid assessment with people to kind of look for the thread, right? Mm-hmm. Now, mountains and backpacking is how I grow closer in my relationship with the natural world, but I know that a lot of people, that is not their way. Their way might be simply to plant something. Or like the client I mentioned earlier, is to sit by a body of water and connect with their father as a way of sort of working on her grief. So it's finding the thread. And I think the book, I wanted so many different stories so that people that read it can find themselves maybe in one story, maybe in more stories, but really sort of broadcasting that there is this big way that we can connect. And I gave a talk once to a big group of mental health professionals, and then there was an evaluation that was sent, and someone had written in, "This is not relevant to me because I work with an urban population and it's not safe to go outside." And I thought to myself, somehow I failed in that way because I want people to understand that, you know, going outside on a hike is one way, but it's not the only way. It is the way that you design your office space, the plants that you keep in, the sounds that you listen to. Nature is anywhere. As soon as you step out, you're in nature, right? Even in an urban center. Um, and so, like, that's why I wanted just a variety of different stories.
I think that's a really good point because I'm often thinking of how many plants, too many plants in my office, and can I cram in there to bring more nature in? Um, it. I was also wondering, is there any story in particular of the ones you chose that maybe resonated with you personally, and why?
Yeah, I would say that there's a story in there about a mom and going down a river rafting, and with her two daughters. And it kind of resonated because as a parent myself of two young people, I am really wanting to nurture their own connection to nature. In the story, what gets in the way is her own fear. Now, the truth is, there are some scary things about nature. Like it is there, right? Scary storms and some of the recreational things that we do can have a risk. Um, but I'm also thinking about how important it is to take healthy risks, and how we are in sort of a risk averse society. And I think that has a huge negative effect. And in the story, that this mother, she's kind of working through all that, right? How to have, introduce my kids to nature, because in an age where technology rules, going out on a hike is boring when I could rather play video games, right? So she's kind of trying to introduce them to nature in her own way, but then the fears of what the river could do kind of get in the way, and realizing that it was actually her own stuff and that everyone was safe. But her own experience with nature was sort of one of feeling unsafe in the river. And so I kind of resonate with that as a parent. You know, Sort of this interaction between healthy risk taking, but also, being safe enough. I like to think of it as we can never be 100% safe in nature, but we can do things to keep it safe enough, and how we kind of create that legacy for our own children so that they can have a solid foundation with nature in a world that's very technology oriented.
I like that. Yeah, that was a really good story that was included in your book. There was another one also that jumped out at me for, I'm not sure, but for a variety of different reasons. And I believe there was a boy attending camp, and it was written from the perspective of his camp counselor, and he had, I think it was autism spectrum disorder, and the other boys in camp would always help him put on his backpack, but the counselor knew that he had to learn how to do it to be more self-sufficient in the wilderness. And so at one point on their hiking journey, she wouldn't let the other boys help him put on his backpack, and she sat there with him for like an hour and a half, and it started to rain, and she told him, "You can do this, you can do this." And after some tears, he eventually figured out a very creative way to put his own backpack on. And I found myself, frustrated for him as a mom. I'm like sad for him, working through almost the same emotions, but then at the same point, like very proud and cheering him on when he did it. And that's something that everyone in the wilderness has to learn ways to be able to be quite self-sufficient. And I've taken groups of my own students into the wilderness and really seen them come into their own, and in some cases master the wilderness better than me. And so I've been just so proud to see that on my own. And so I really liked that story. It resonated a lot with me. But what struck me in reading all of these different chapters that you included in your book is the different type of content with nature that was needed for that transformational healing. It varies from person to person. In some of the narratives, it was something like bird watching. So, in other words, just like you're saying, you don't have to backpack up to Mount Everest base camp. Like it can be something as simple as bird watching from the window, looking out into a yard. It can be something more drastic, like hiking the Appalachian Trail. It can be something as simple as laying in the grass. In one story, a girl was laying in the grass, connecting and really focusing on the mindfulness and being of laying in the grass. And that was her connection with nature. And I guess, how does one determine the best way to interact with nature if one is needing healing to take place for whatever that is? Maybe it's anxiety, maybe it's grief, maybe they're just burnt out at work, because I know a lot of people I know tend to be burnt out. And there's so many different ways to interact with nature. How does one figure out what that connection is, what that thread is?
Yeah, so this is where we can talk a little bit about this concept called place attachment. So humans, we have place attachment to different places, different landscapes, right? And how we form this place attachment can happen through a variety of different ways. One is we will have place attachment to places that we had positive childhood memories. So if you grew up in a family that would go, to Ocean City regularly, or you went to a camp up north, or your family would go to Colorado and hike some trails, right? If you had positive childhood experiences, you will have a place attachment to those kind of experiences and those type of places. It could also be that as a child, you made friends with the tree in your yard, right? You named it or you hugged it. That will also contribute to place attachment. So one of the things to do is we want to think about what are some of those experiences we had in childhood in nature as a form of place attachment. And then as adults, what types of landscapes and or recreational activities do you find pleasant to yourself? And so there we get to sort of these place attachments. And again, when we're struggling through anxiety, depression, grief, we often are fully paying attention to just the grief or the pain, right? And so it's then my role to remind people that there is something there that has been pleasant for them, that has been beneficial to them, that they could draw solace from. And so we go back to childhood experiences or current adult pleasant experiences in nature, and we sort of bring that together. And so in that way, we really want to help people understand what place attachment is, and see if we can, in an assessment, maybe find out if there were any pleasant memories in nature, and see if they can recreate those, and sort of finding the thread in that way, the thread back to nature.
That's a really good point, and it makes me think of all of the places in nature that I've interacted with as a kid. I think I'm kind of like you in that when I was growing up, my parents took me outside a lot. Like we did a lot of hiking in national parks. So not the Alps or anything like that, but quite a bit of hiking in national parks. And so I have that type of place attachment to certain parks that they would always take me to growing up. So I want to actually jump to a question that was asked in our chat, which I think, thank you, Amy, for asking this question. Have you found any gendered differences in the way that humans interact with nature? Which I thought that's a great question. So I wanted to make sure I got to that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I will say, from my kind of lens that I look at that through connection is, the place attachment piece, childhood memories, who like a nature role model, someone in a family system or a camp counselor, someone that introduced you to nature. So those seem to be, they're not really any huge gender differences. It really depends on what was role modeled to you in terms of your nature connection early on. When we're looking at like adults, what we do find maybe a little bit is sort of that threshold where we're willing to do maybe a little bit more risk-taking behaviors. So with, mountain biking, rock climbing, mountaineering, some of those, what we see just in terms of the numbers of people that participate, there seems to be a larger male component to those kind of more risk-taking. But it could be, socialization as an effect on that. What we have found just from our observation is we're offering nature-based mental health events, such as backpacking, into the backpacking, or we take people out on the water. We're seeing those kind of group events have a larger participation from men than we did in the past when we just offered, group therapy indoors.
Okay, that makes sense to me in terms of the difference in maybe the more risky behavior. Just from my own anecdotal, I have 2 teenage sons that want to try skydiving. My daughter is like, no, I don't want to try that. So that from my perspective makes sense. I wanted to ask, and Mary, I see your question. I'll get to it in just a second. Many of us in the environmental community, especially the students that I work with, experience a degree of what I've heard you refer to as eco grief, or I've also heard others describe as climate grief. Can you first explain in the more official definition of what is that, and what are some coping mechanisms for dealing with eco grief or climate grief?
Yeah, so I guess the newest term that is floating around in the field is eco despair. And eco despair kind of encompasses the grief and the anxiety, or really encompasses all these sort of intense emotions that might be labeled as negative emotions, but they're really just a response to the concern about the health of the planet. And with it often comes this sort of sense of overwhelm, feeling overwhelmed by the intensity of the issues of the planetary health. And so people start experiencing the grief, the anxiety, but often then because of these big emotions, they start not kind of engaging in it. It's almost like they're afraid the emotions are too big, so they just kind of don't listen to the news anymore. They're sort of tapping out of this conversation. And so what we're doing sort of as a psychological response to eco despair is we're actually really doing a lot of trainings, educations on this idea of staying what we call in the window of tolerance, which in the window of tolerance is when we are sort of engaging in a healthy way, when we're not overwhelmed by the emotions, where we kind of shut off and put our head in the sand, where we can stay active and engaged. One thing that I found through my research is that when people, there's a correlational factor between connectedness to nature and activism. So we want to, continue to connect people with nature so that will translate into activism. But I think also is addressing this sense of, grief doesn't have to be overwhelming. And also noticing that anyone who's in the field knows that humans have what we call the negativity bias, which is the mind thinking only of what's wrong. And it's just looking for things that are wrong. And humans with a negativity bias are only going to hear the things that are going wrong, right? All the species we're losing, all the things that are happening. But there's also a lot of reason for climate hope. And that's allowing the mind to, release this own echo chamber and actually start looking at some of the things that are happening that are reasons for hope. So that we stay in that window of tolerance, not become overwhelmed, and we can continue to engage. We need everyone to engage in this activism.
That helps. Thank you. I like that you're connecting that with activism, because I know that as an educator in that environmental field and the climate field, we often approach, like, if you feel like you can't do anything in terms of an environmental issue or a climate issue, we connect that with, okay, learning about the issue, the science of the issue, and then meet activism, and here's what you can do. But integrating that nature connectedness, I mean, obviously, as an educator, I'm not a mental health professional, but knowing that there are resources for students and colleagues should they need those resources, that's really nice to know, and knowing that we can point people in those directions, but knowing that it can also be paired with activism so people don't feel like disengaged, like there's nothing that they can do. I think we don't.
There's also a organization, it's called the Psychological Climate Alliance, and they are training mental health professionals on how to work with people that have eco despair. And because there's just very few trainings out there, and as therapists, we often have our own eco despair, right? But we want to be able to help people have these conversations in the therapy room because it affects people's emotions and their mental health.
Yeah, that's good to know that there's additional training on that. I want to make sure I get to Mary's question, and then I also want to remind our audience that if you guys have any questions, you can type your question in the chat, and I'll try to make sure we have time to ask that. Mary asked, can you comment on experiencing the sense of awe in nature and associated benefits of that sense for mental health? And her question reminds me that this is also a time of year when a lot of people are traveling to beautiful places, also outside, and seeing beautiful things and getting that sense of awe when they're out in nature. Maybe people visiting the Grand Canyon or visiting something, I don't know, Sequoia National Park or something like that. And that sense of awe is often prevalent when they're visiting these beautiful places. So
Yeah.
what is the nature-informed therapy say about that connection between the sense of awe and the benefits to mental health?
So I want to thank Mary for asking that question because this could be a whole 8-hour lecture just on its own. The UC Berkeley has been doing incredible work on the scientific investigation of awe. And our understanding of that is really increasing. So awe is a fascinating concept. And one of the things we want to think about is that 9 out of 10 people report having experienced awe through or with the engagement with the natural world. So a lot of people experience awe. And when we experience awe, what UC Berkeley and their research shows is that it creates something in the brain where parts of the brain start activating that have to do with pro-social behavior, feeling connected to others, being more empathetic, and which is really interesting because no one really kind of saw that one coming. Now, when we experience awe, we also become more connected to other humans in a positive way. And I think we could all agree that we're in a time of in our country where more pro-social behavior towards others and empathy would benefit all of us. So here's what UC Berkeley did, right? What they wanted to find out is, like you mentioned, right? We go to the Grand Canyon and we have this amazing experience of awe. And in that moment, we come out of ego-centeredness because humans are very ego-centered. It's me, I'm the center of the universe, all my feelings and thoughts, me, right? But when we're having awe experience, we're actually dropping out of ego and into something bigger than ourselves, right? Something that we're touching on to something that has been here before us and will be here in some form after we leave. And it's like this amazing moment of becoming part of humanity on a much bigger scale, right? And that's actually a really beneficial thing for humans to do, to get out of our heads, right? We all want that. We want it all. Get it out of our heads and into something, our body, something bigger than ourselves. So what UC Berkeley did is they tried to figure out, we can't send everyone to the Grand Canyon. All needs to be accessible to people on a day-to-day basis if we really want to, have this, affect us in this positive way. So they did a study where they had people for 1 week go out into their backyards or into their neighborhoods and stroll around. But their task was to actually make note of something in their neighborhoods, in their yards that inspired awe. And then they were supposed to either create a sketch or take a picture of it. And at the end of the week, they were sharing all these different times where they experienced awe. And people took pictures or sketches of very simple things, right? They of a flower that was blooming, of a bird's nest that had baby birds in it. Of a bee collecting nectar on the flower. Like, it was these ordinary but extraordinary moments that all of a sudden, with the eyes of wonder, people started noticing, right? It's almost like you're asking people to put glasses on, and through those glasses, you now are going to see these moments of awe that are unfolding on our everyday lives, but we don't see them because we're caught up in our own thinking head, and because we're caught up with the to-do list, and because we've been in our backyards a million times, and how can there still be awe? And yet there is awe in your backyards.
I like that. I feel like that should all be like a hobby, that we all have like a little nature journal and we go out in our backyards, and our task one day, every day, is to sketch something that gives us awe in our yard. I think we would all feel better if we did something like that. Even if you can't draw like me, it would be a good task. Maybe take a picture of it if you can't. But I think that's a nice, actually, that leads me into my next question, which is, I imagine that some of the people joining us today in our audience, and even some of my fellow students, are interested in connecting more with nature, maybe for different reasons, maybe for stress, maybe for grief, maybe for anger or fear, whatever the reason. What would you recommend is the first step to connect with nature for different people, different reasons?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I will say that there's two pieces that we might want to consider when we bring, more new intention around our connection to nature. The one is the word unstructured, and the other one is in solitude. So I'm going to go over both of them. So unstructured, what we know about unstructured time in nature. So when you're thinking about, okay, there's all this research on the benefits of the natural world on my brain and on my body, people feel better, more relaxed, they're more connected, all that stuff. But your biggest bang for the buck, so to speak, is that when you're actually doing unstructured times in nature. So this is really interesting, because when we view children, when parents will say, oh, my child is outside all the time, they're doing soccer practice, they're on a soccer team, but that's structured outdoor play, right? Structured. So they're doing drills and things like that. But when we see really deep connection happening between humans and the more than human world, is when it's a little bit more unstructured. Like, for example, in an adult, it might look like this. Perhaps you're the type of hiker that, you've got your map, you know how many miles you want to do, you're getting a workout in, and that is good for you. But when we're really intentionally looking at connection to nature, maybe going and not having an agenda, maybe noticing what calls your interest, what trail to go down on, maybe not doing 5 miles, maybe just doing 1 mile, and just noticing and putting those glasses of wonder on. So unstructured, right? And the other thing is in solitude. So if you are a person that walks every day in nature, and you go with your neighbor because you need an accountability buddy, because you need the exercise, and you're walking and talking, in that moment, you're actually, your brain, because we're social beings, is pretty much only paying attention to the socialization that's happening, right? Catching up with your neighbor, talking about these experiences. In the background, nature is happening. And there's still some benefit to that. But if you're alone in nature, right? And you are not multitasking, so you're not holding a conversation, and you're just paying attention to nature. That's all the job is you're just paying attention to nature. You're hearing that bird. You're really hearing it. You're really seeing the different birds, right? That is taking your connection to nature maybe on a kind of a deeper level. There is a practice that we often introduce people to. And the practice is called the sit spot, as in sitting. And every day you commit to 10 minutes of sitting in nature in the same spot. So it should be something very easily to access, like your backyard. Um, and every day, the goal is just to go out there for 10 minutes, sit down, and just pay attention to nature. Keep your eyes open. You do want your mind not to be doing your to-do list or what to cook for dinner. You keep bringing the mind back, just like in mindfulness, but we're actually paying attention to nature. For me, when I first started doing my sit spot, I saw there was a branch that had fallen down, and I just paid attention to nature around me, and I saw that this ant was really like carrying this really heavy object, and it was moving it, and then it couldn't anymore because it was much bigger than itself. And then there was 3 or 4 friends that came along and then helped move it a bit further. And I just got caught up in this amazing thing that was happening right by my feet. And moments just flew by. I mean, 10 minutes were long gone. And I just paid attention. And it just was such a break from my own thinking mind. And at the same time, helped me connect to the very ecological system that's right in my own backyard.
I like that. I like that idea of just anywhere that we have accessible to us, just going outside and sitting down and paying attention to nature for 10 minutes. And it's remarkably simple to do. We have to make sure we keep our mind on nature, though, when we're doing it, and not whatever paper we're writing or the to-do list. I like to take walks in nature. I take a walk every day. I do sometimes listen to a podcast when I'm doing it, but sometimes I don't, and I just walk. And I like to listen to the bird song when I do it. And it's remarkable to pay attention to the different birds as they move through the area, the different seasons the birds change. It is very calming, and I started doing that a couple years ago, and I really like it. We have still time for a couple more questions, so if anyone has a question for Heidi, please post it in our chat, and I will give voice to that. One of my last questions for you is that more specifically about fear, because I've met a lot of people through the years, and I remember as a child I feared water, which I eventually overcame. But for those that are working to overcome a fear of nature, whether that's a fear of the ocean or a fear of forests or maybe a fear of really tall mountains, whatever, or a fear of wildlife, because there's different kinds of wildlife that people fear, whatever that fear is, how do you work explicitly with them to help them overcome fear? And what do you recommend for them when you're trying to help them connect with nature?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we want to first, I think that we kind of look for the thread first. So if someone has a fear of snakes, we might not do a walk and talk session at the park, right? We're going to start at, maybe at a garden or just sitting out on the porch. And so we take these kind of small baby steps towards the goal. If the person wants to, because it keeps them from certain nature experiences, they really want to be okay with that. And then we just, we kind of increase those steps more and more frequently. Meanwhile, we're also helping a person with different tools and practices such as breath work to actually help when they are triggered by something to bring their nervous system back in alignment. So it kind of goes hand in hand. I will also say that, if someone is terrified of of climbing a mountain because they're fear of heights and they're not planning on doing that, I'm like, you know what, there are so many other ways to connect to nature. Let that one go and focus on what's easy for you, because nature has so many different ways that we can connect. I do a course up at Ladue Gardens, and I found that for some of my clients that have more fears around nature, especially how the wooded areas and the woods, they have found deep connection at Ladue Gardens. Just by the waters there, the flowers there. And so to me and to them, that's good enough. But if someone really does want to work on some of those fears, we usually do some type of like exposure, where we just kind of in incremental steps try to help the mind, settle down and see that it's actually not something that is very, very dangerous.
That's good to hear. And I think Amy commented that she goes to Ladue as well for that reason. So um, thanks for the recommendation. Well, thank you for sharing that. I think that does help. I think we've had I know in my own experience I've just in teaching courses outdoors, I've had different students. Typically it's a fear of some form of wildlife that I've had seen in students. And also insects or bugs. Is there anything in particular beyond just exposure to insects that you've kind of had to walk through with that?
Yeah, I think that before we're out in the field is to talking a little bit about like how we would keep people safe, safe enough, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like let's say there was, a bug that they would feel, triggered by. We would talk them through in the office. Here's what we would do, sort of a step-by-step plan so that they feel prepared to do what they need to do once it happens. And once people have a plan and are prepared, the fear is actually a lot less when they are out in the field.
That's good. Yeah, I think I know it just in my own experience as a kid in the great outdoors, a lot of times I found that my fears, the reality was a lot easier to handle than what my fears were. And once I realized that in the great outdoors,
Yeah.
the fears just disintegrated. And I imagine that happens when you're taking people that you're working with outdoors to deal with different things like that.
We
Um,
always have this question that we like to ask people this, and the question is, can you name 3 things that are going to make you feel safer about being outdoors? What are three
okay.
things that we could do as a group or together that would make you feel safer to be out in nature?
Oh, okay. And you try to do all three to
Yeah,
implement
well,
them
at least we
as
have a
best possible.
conversation around it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's good to hear. Do you ever, and last question, do you ever take groups of people out together? Because you mentioned solitary interactions with nature, but do you ever, as part of your therapy, take out groups together? And if you do that, what's kind of the ideal group size?
Yeah, we do a lot of groups. And what we found is that groups tend to have quicker cohesion and trust and empathy outdoors versus indoor groups, which is a really interesting finding. We do a lot of groups and usually probably not larger than 12. Sort of 8 to 12 is a really great ideal. Now they will still go out and have a solitary experience and then bring it back to the group. We do like forest therapy invitations where they're kind of going out on their own for 10, 15 minutes and then bringing it back and sharing their experience. But it's really nice to have like connecting with other humans around that
Mhm.
nature experience.
Oh, that's good to hear. Yeah, because I think just from what I've seen as an outdoor educator sometimes is that there's a different dynamic to a group learning outdoors
Yes.
and a lot of shared experiences that can build a
Yeah.
lot of camaraderie. And sometimes those groups will stay in communication for years after the fact, way more than just a regular classroom will. So,
Yeah.
yeah, there's a bonding that happens outdoors that you don't necessarily see in a traditional setting. So that's nice to hear.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you for joining us today and for sharing your insight in nature-informed therapy. And I also want to thank our audience for joining us today. And I think it's been just a fascinating conversation. Thank you, Heidi, for sharing the link for natureinformedtherapy.com. And I am also going to just reshare if anyone wants to join our Goucher Environment, well, first of all, this is recorded and I will share the recording with you guys later on. So all Goucher Environmental Dialogues, we have a YouTube channel. So they're going to be on the YouTube channel. And we have an information session about our Masters in Environmental Sustainability and Management next week, if any of you are interested in learning more about the program that sponsors Goucher Environmental Dialogues. And since we are virtual and we can't have applause, if you want to just say thank you to Heidi in the chat, I would greatly appreciate that. And otherwise, everyone enjoy the rest of your July 5th. And if anyone's traveling or anything like that, have a safe travel.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it. Take care.